Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight, I'll take you far away from the comfort of your own room, out into the Bavarian countryside of the early 1920s. A place where the nights were long, the forest dense, and the silence heavy enough to make your skin prickle. In that silence stood a lonely farmhouse, cut off from the world by fields and trees. On the surface, it was just another farm, with animals in the barn, smoke curling from the chimney, and neighbours a good walk away. Ordinary, almost dull, yet beneath that ordinary surface, something was stirring. Something that would leave behind a puzzle no one has solved to this day. What happened there still unsettles anyone who dares to look too closely. A mixture of fact and folklore, of investigators chasing shadows, and of stories whispered for generations. And as we go deeper tonight, you'll see how one quiet corner of Bavaria became a place history refuses to forget. So, let me take over for a while. Make yourself comfortable, settle in, and allow the past to unfold slowly, piece by piece. If you enjoy wandering into these strange corners of history, a like and subscribe always helps to keep the stories alive. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to something that should help you drift, even as the mystery lingers. The Bavarian countryside doesn't like to give up its secrets easily. Back in the early 1920s, long before neon lights and highways carved their way across Germany, the land around a small place called Kaifeck was mostly fields, trees, and mud. Roads were more like tracks, carved into the soil by carts and boots. On misty mornings, the horizon blurred, and you could imagine the world ending just beyond the next row of firs. It was beautiful in a bleak kind of way, the kind of scenery that both comforts and unsettles, depending on how long you've been staring into it. At the edge of that landscape stood a farmhouse, not grand, not particularly charming, but solid. Stone walls, timber beams, a roof that sagged slightly from years of snow and rain. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney when the hearth was lit, and the lowing of cows or the restless stamping of horses filled the air around the barn. To anyone passing by, it was just another working farm, the sort that dotted Bavaria like freckles on a pale face. Yet Hinterkaifeck, as it was called, was more than just remote. It was cut off. A neighbour's house was a good walk away, and when the night fell, deep and black, with only the stars for company, the farmhouse seemed to stand alone at the very edge of the known world. You could almost feel the trees leaning closer, as if they wanted to swallow it whole. People in nearby villages knew the place, of course. They nodded when its name came up, but never with much warmth. They said life there was hard, strict, and isolated. They said the family kept to themselves, and sometimes that silence carried an edge. Inside, daily routines ticked along as they always had. Animals fed and watered, fields tended, bread baked, tools mended. Ordinary tasks in an ordinary rhythm. And yet, there was something about the farm that lingered with anyone who visited. Perhaps it was the quiet, heavier than it should have been. Perhaps it was the way the woods pressed in, cutting the farm off from the comfort of the neighbours' voices. Or perhaps it was nothing at all. Just the kind of imagination that grows wild when you're standing somewhere far too still. Isolation has a way of amplifying things. Every creak of the barn door, every loose board shifting underfoot, every wind that pushed against the shutters. It all became louder, sharper, as if the house itself were alive and paying attention. People who spent the night at Hinterkaifeck often left with a feeling they couldn't quite explain. That feeling of being watched, not by people, but by the walls themselves. Of course, in 1922, such thoughts would have been brushed off. People were practical. They had fields to plough and mouths to feed. Nobody had time for ghost stories. But in hindsight, when you already know what happened, it's hard not to imagine the farm holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for the moment when silence would turn into something else entirely. And that is where we begin. In the fog, with an isolated farmstead, and with a sense of unease creeping in long before anyone realized how justified that unease truly was. Late March in Bavaria doesn't offer much comfort. The air is sharp, carrying the damp weight of soil that refuses to warm after winter. Nights stretch on longer than they should, and the wind finds every crack in every wall. At Hinterkaifeck, the lamps were dimmed, the animals settled, and the family inside wrapped themselves in the familiar rhythm of evening. It should have been an ordinary night, unremarkable and forgettable. One of those evenings that vanish from memory the moment they pass. But hindsight has a cruel way of colouring the ordinary. When we look back, every sound seems loaded with meaning. The clatter of a latch, the bark of a dog, the distant crunch of footsteps on frozen earth. Did anyone inside notice? Did they glance at the window, wondering if the shadows outside shifted too much to be just the trees? Or did routine win, pushing away unease the way people do when fear feels foolish? What we do know is this. Someone approached the farm. Not a neighbour coming to borrow a tool, not a lost traveller seeking shelter. The approach was deliberate, steady. A figure moving through the fields, unseen by the world beyond those woods. Once at the edge of the farmhouse, they didn't turn back. Inside, the family followed their evening patterns. Perhaps Andreas, the father, checking the locks. Victoria, his daughter, settling her young boy into bed. The grandmother Maria, preparing for rest. The young maid, barely settled into her new position, still unfamiliar with the quirks of this household, each in their own space, each caught in the illusion of safety that walls and roofs are supposed to provide. The silence outside thickened. The animals, it was later said, grew restless. A dog barked, perhaps in warning, perhaps in panic. These details come to us like fragments, scattered by time and testimony. None of them form a complete picture, and maybe that's why the case has lived on, because it's stitched together with gaps. What happened next is shrouded in speculation. The accepted version is chilling in its simplicity. The intruder entered the barn first. One by one, members of the household stepped into that space, each unaware that the person before them would not return. It's a sequence that feels both impossible and disturbingly plausible. In the dim light of a lantern, in the muffled quiet of a barn, surprise is an ally. And fear. Fear can freeze a person long enough for events to take their course. By the time the night was fully claimed, the farmhouse was no longer what it had been. Shadows stretched differently across its walls. Silence deepened into something oppressive. The ordinary rhythms, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of boots were gone. Instead, the building seemed to retreat into itself, holding tight the horror it now contained. And yet, this is the strangest part. The world outside didn't notice. Not right away. The farm carried on in appearance. The chimney still sent up its thin plume of smoke. The animals were fed. The stables tended. Whoever had come to Hinterkaifeck, they hadn't left in haste. They lingered. Slept, perhaps. Ate meals in the kitchen. Maintained the illusion that life inside went on. Imagine that. Neighbours walking past. glancing across fields, seeing smoke raising as usual. The suggestion of normal life, masking what lay within. Days would pass before the curtain was pulled back, before anyone realized that something unspeakable had taken place behind those walls. For now, though, the farm sat in silence, as if waiting, holding its dreadful secret close, while the outside world remained oblivious. Silence is easy to ignore when you expect it. Farms are often quiet, after all. Animals shift, wind rattles the shutters, and days pass without much fuss. But the silence at Hinterkaifeck after that March night wasn't ordinary. It was too complete, too heavy, like a thick blanket thrown over the land. The neighbours noticed, but at first only in passing. No one saw the family in the fields. No friendly wave across the dirt track. The school teacher wondered why young Cecilia hadn't turned up to class. The postman dropping off the weekly paper remarked that no one had come out to greet him. These were small things, the kind of details you brush aside when life is busy. Farms have their rhythms, and sometimes they shift. People fall ill. Work pulls them away. You don't imagine the worst straight away. Not in a quiet village where scandal usually means someone's cow wandered into the wrong pasture. But the days stretched on, and excuses became harder to believe. The maid, who had only just arrived, hadn't been seen since. Victoria's presence in the church choir was suddenly absent. The family's routines, normally steady as clockwork, had vanished into the fog. And yet, signs of life remained. Thin smoke rose from the chimney. The animals, while restless, were clearly being tended. Someone had milked the cows, fed the livestock, even baked bread in the kitchen. All of it gave the impression that things at Hinterkaifeck were fine. Strange, perhaps, but fine. It was as if the farm itself conspired to keep up appearances, maintaining a mask of normality. That mask unsettled people more than an outright absence would have. Who was feeding the animals, if not the family? Who was keeping the fire alive in the hearth? Neighbours began to murmur, their unease slipping into conversations over fences and at the village inn. But still, no one rushed to the farmhouse. Country folk are wary of meddling. Privacy is respected, sometimes to a fault. Meanwhile, the silence deepened. The forest around the farm grew thicker with suspicion. The nights colder. The sense of unease spreading like frost through the village. Each day, without word from Hinterkaifeck, sharpened the edge of worry. But worry is a tricky thing. It can paralyze just as much as it can spur action. By the fourth day, tension was impossible to ignore. The teacher pressed again about Cecilia's absence. The neighbours, who once brushed off their concerns, now found themselves circling back to them. Something was wrong, they agreed at last. The farm might look alive from the outside, but it was too quiet, too guarded. The air around it seemed to resist visitors. Still, approaching the place took courage. To step onto the property meant crossing that invisible line between speculation and certainty. And once you crossed, there would be no turning back. Because everyone suspected, deep down, that the silence of Hinterkaifeck wasn't just silence. It was concealment. A warning, even. And so, at last, a small group of neighbours gathered. Together they decided to walk the familiar path across the fields, past the trees, to the farmhouse that had gone dark in spirit, if not in appearance. What they found there would stain the village memory forever. It was the last day of March when the neighbours finally gathered their courage. A small group, uneasy but determined, made their way across the fields towards Hinterkaifeck. The path was familiar. Muddy in spring, edged by bare trees, but that morning it seemed longer than usual. Each step carried the weight of what they feared they might find. When they reached the yard, the farmhouse looked deceptively normal. The chimney still gave off its lazy smoke. The barn doors stood heavy and silent. No cries for help, no frantic signs of distress, only the same oppressive quiet that had unsettled them all week. For a moment, someone suggested turning back, but turning back would only have left the silence to fester. So they pushed on. The barn was the first place they searched. The doors groaned open, and a stale draft met them. Hay, dust, and something else they couldn't quite place. They stepped inside, lantern light cutting through the dimness. The animals shifted restlessly in their stalls, as if glad for company. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Just a barn, cluttered and ordinary, and then they saw it. Beneath a crude pile of straw and farm tools, something lay where nothing should have been. The first to notice froze, unable to speak, pointing only with a trembling hand. Slowly, the others moved closer, each step heavier than the last, until the outline beneath the hay could no longer be mistaken for anything innocent. They pulled back the straw, and the truth came into view. What they uncovered was not one figure, but several, layered together, hidden with the kind of haste that speaks of both panic and intent. A family, lifeless, concealed in the very space that should have sheltered them. Shock rooted the neighbours where they stood. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed, as if the barn itself demanded silence in witness. They did not stop there. Fear drove them to search further, though each discovery only deepened their horror. In the house, more bodies were found. The young maid, barely begun in her service. The boy, small and innocent, lying in his bed as if he had simply fallen asleep. The farmhouse that had seemed merely quiet was now revealed for what it was. A place where life had been extinguished days earlier. The neighbours stumbled back into the yard, pale and shaken, their lanterns swinging wildly in trembling hands. Some muttered prayers, others cursed under their breath. Together, they had stepped into a nightmare. And unlike the silence of the days before, this new silence carried certainty. Hinterkaifeck was no longer just a farm. It was a crime scene, though that phrase barely existed in their world. Word travelled quickly. By evening, the village was buzzing with disbelief, fear, and speculation. Who could have done such a thing? Why this family, in this place, cut off yet seemingly safe? The questions multiplied as fast as the rumours, but answers were nowhere to be found. For now, all anyone knew was that the farmhouse at the edge of the woods had revealed its secret, and with that revelation, the uneasy quiet that had hung over Hinterkaifeck gave way to something far heavier. The long, messy process of trying to make sense of the senseless. By the time the authorities arrived, the farm was no longer a scene to be studied, but a place already touched by too many hands. Word had spread fast, faster than any official could, and the curious had come first. They meant well, or so they said. Neighbours checking on neighbours, men from the village offering help, a few who simply couldn't resist the pull of the unbelievable. Doors were opened, tools moved, lanterns carried from room to room. In the barn, footprints overlapped until the floor was a muddle of soles and smudges. Whatever the night had left behind in terms of neat, readable traces was quickly trampled into confusion. When the constables finally reached Hinterkaifeck, they were greeted not by a contained scene, but by a quiet commotion. People stood in clusters, talking in stiff, hushed voices. Someone had seen something. Someone else had moved something. A third person insisted they knew the order in which rooms had been entered. It was all very confident and all very contradictory. The first job should have been to clear the yard, to empty the farmhouse, to treat the place like the delicate set of clues it was. Instead, the line between witness and participant blurred at the door. Inside, the muddle continued. A coat that had been on a peg was now over a chair. A tool that might have mattered had been picked up, examined, and put back, though not quite where it had been found. A lantern was relit, then moved again. In the kitchen, the faint after-smell of a meal hung in the air, as if someone had recently warmed food on the stove. Whether that someone was from the household in those missing days, or one of the self-appointed helpers, was impossible to say. It is a truth too often learned after the fact. A place of violence is also a place of fragile information. Every object and every silence holds weight. But in 1922, Bavaria, procedures were a patchwork. The nearest officers did what they could with what they had, and what they had was limited. Few men, few tools, and a crowd that could not be easily sent home. Even simple tasks, listing who had entered first, who had opened which door, were complicated by pride and panic. The notes that were taken were sketchy, the statements gathered were already shaped by rumour. More senior officials were called in, of course. When they arrived, they found a site that looked orderly enough to the untrained eye, but was, in investigative terms, frayed at every edge. The barn had been disturbed. The house had been walked through several times. Children from the village, brought by anxious parents who should have known better, had whispered to each other in doorways, pointing at things they would later misremember. The boundary between observation and contamination had dissolved before the first proper report could be begun. There were, nevertheless, attempts at method. The bodies were documented as best as possible, placed as they were found in barn and house. A doctor was summoned to conduct examinations on site, crude by modern standards, but, given the remoteness of the location, considered practical. Measurements were taken. Times were estimated. The cold had preserved some details, obscured others. Items were collected, labelled in a fashion that made sense to those present on the day, and would later prompt arguments about what had been picked up, when, and by whom. Questions multiplied. Why had the farm seemed alive in the days after the event? Animals tended. Fires kept going. Why were keys missing? Why were certain doors locked, others ajar? Who had entered first among the villagers, and what exactly had they moved? The officers asked. The villagers answered, and the answers changed as the shock wore off, and stories hardened into certainties. One man swore he had seen a particular footprint. Another insisted it wasn't there. A third said there had been a newspaper in the house that no one in the household subscribed to, though where it came from was anyone's guess. The timeline, too, was a struggle. The school noted absences. The postman recalled deliveries. The neighbours remembered a dog barking at odd hours, and lights in rooms where none should have been. None of it formed a clean line. It was as if the farm itself had learned the trick of misdirection, showing life where there was none, erasing detail where it mattered. If there was a single defining error that week, it was not malice or negligence so much as the slow, unstoppable slide from order into confusion. Too many boots on old boards, too many eyes guessing at meaning. Too much chatter passed from mouth to mouth until memory bent to the pressure of a good story. Later, experts would shake their heads at all this. Later, people would say, if only they had cleared the yard. If only they had sealed the rooms. If only the first hour had been different. But the first hour had already been lost before a uniform even crossed the threshold. From that shaky beginning, the investigation did proceed. Lists of suspects began to form, first in pencil and then, with more confidence than certainty, in ink. Interviews were scheduled, alibis collected, theories bred like mice. Some were plausible, some theatrical. The file thickened, but the ground truth seemed to thin under the weight of it. Every time the officers felt they had a grip on the shape of things, a new witness produced a memory, and the shape shifted again. And outside the farmhouse, the village shifted too. Fear is infectious. Suspicion is even more so. Old quarrels resurfaced with convenient timing. Old whispers acquired sharp, new edges. The investigation didn't just move through Hinterkaifeck. It moved through the people who lived within walking distance of it, stirring up everything that had long been left politely unsaid. By the week's end, the authorities had managed to impose a veneer of order, logs, statements, a plan for what to do next. But beneath that veneer lay the messy truth that the case had started with a stumble, and that stumble would shadow every step that followed. The farm was quiet again, at least to the ear. On paper, though, it had become loud, a chorus of contradictions, all claiming to be the first and last word on what had happened. Next came the harder part, facing the village that had seen too much and understood too little, and asking questions that would turn neighbours into suspects. News in a village doesn't travel by newspaper, it travels by whisper. By the time the investigation had taken its first faltering steps at Hinterkaifeck, every kitchen table within miles was already hosting its own trial. People leaned in over mugs of beer, over bread and soup, repeating what they'd heard, embellishing it, reshaping it until the story sounded almost like folklore. Fear, of course, was the main ingredient. The idea that something so unspeakable could happen not in a distant city, not in some darkened alley, but here, in their own fields, in their own woods, was too large to digest. And so the villagers tried to shrink it, to fit it into the patterns they understood. If such a thing had happened, then it must have been caused by someone familiar, someone they could point to, because the alternative, that a stranger might slip silently across the snow and vanish just as quietly, was unbearable. The children heard the whispers too. They weren't meant to, but children are experts at listening to doors half closed. Soon they were repeating the rumours in the schoolyard, daring each other to walk closer to Hinterkaifeck at dusk, spinning tales about shadows that moved in the barn, about the dog that barked at invisible figures. By the end of the week, the farm wasn't just a crime scene. It was the village's haunted house. Daily life bent under the weight of suspicion. The choir at church sang without Victoria's voice, and the gap seemed louder than the music. The schoolteacher marked absences in his register, the empty seat of little Cazelia impossible to ignore. Farmers glancing across their fields now saw not neighbours, but possible culprits. Every quarrel of the past years resurfaced. Arguments about land boundaries, debts unpaid, slights real or imagined. Suddenly, each one was a possible motive. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbour who had led others to the farm, became the focus of sideways glances. He had a history with the family, after all. He had entered the barn with uncanny certainty, some said, moving straight to the pile of hay that concealed the truth. Too straight, too certain. People whispered about inheritance disputes, about grudges, about things left unsaid between him and Victoria. Was he a helpful neighbour or something more sinister? Depending on whom you asked, the answer shifted like smoke. The unease went beyond gossip. Doors were locked more tightly at night. Lamps burned longer. Farmers took to carrying tools when walking alone. Nothing dramatic, just enough to feel less exposed. The forest, once a place of wood gathering and hunting, seemed to lean darker over the village. People avoided the path past Hinterkaifeck if they could, even in daylight. The church tried to calm the storm. Sermons spoke of patience, of trust, of leaving judgment to higher powers. But sermons are weak against rumour. In the pews, heads nodded dutifully, and in the tavern afterwards, tongues wagged with twice the speed. Even those who tried to stay silent found themselves caught in the net of speculation. A glance, a hesitation, an old story told in jest years earlier, all of it could be pulled into the growing narrative of guilt. And yet, beneath all the chatter, there was grief. 6 lives had ended, and the village could not fully grasp the scale of it. A family gone, a child silenced, a maid who had barely begun her service cut short. The shock was so raw that it found no proper outlet. Instead of mourning, people argued. Instead of candles, they lit suspicions. Instead of prayers, they whispered names. The farmhouse itself stood as a constant reminder, a dark outline against the grey sky. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The animals had been removed. Windows stared blankly, unlit. And every passerby felt the same prickle at the back of the neck. That sense of looking at a place which had shifted permanently from homestead to scar. For the investigators, the pressure grew unbearable. They weren't only facing a crime, they were facing a community that demanded resolution, demanded names, demanded certainty. But certainty was in short supply. And so the police turned inward, combing the farmhouse again and again, desperate to wring meaning from the muddled scene. The village waited, restless, feeding itself on rumour and fear. And in that restless silence, Hinterkaifeck became not just a crime to be solved, but a mirror in which every neighbour wondered, how well do we really know each other? To understand Hinterkaifeck, you have to picture it clearly, not as a vague farmhouse lost in the Bavarian woods, but as a set of spaces stitched together, each with its own weight. Only then does the strange choreography of that night, and of the days that followed, begin to take shape. The farmhouse was not large by aristocratic standards, but for a working family it was substantial. A long structure where living quarters and barn connected under one roof. The way it often was in rural Bavaria. Stone on the lower levels, timber above, with walls thick enough to hold the cold at bay. The roof sagged a little with age, patched here and there where storms had left their mark. Step into the yard, and you'd face the big barn doors first. Broad, heavy, creaking on their hinges. Inside lay the heart of the farm's labour. Straw piled high, tools hanging from hooks, the earthy smell of livestock seeping into every beam. From here, doors led into stalls for cows and horses, and further still into the living quarters. The boundary between work and home blurred in these spaces. The farm was not a house next to a barn, but a single living organism, half human, half animal. The living rooms themselves were modest, a kitchen with a large stove, blackened by years of wood smoke, where bread was baked and simple meals prepared. A table, sturdy but scarred, around which the family gathered. A few bedrooms, their furnishings plain, wooden beds, woolen blankets, crucifixes on the walls. There was no luxury here, only function. Even comfort had a practical edge, thick curtains to keep the cold out, rugs to soften the floors, a clock that ticked not for beauty, but for order. What matters about this layout is not just its simplicity, but its intimacy. Every room pressed close against the next, every sound travelled. The bark of a dog in the yard, the shuffle of boots in the barn, the strike of a match in the kitchen. All of it echoed through the house. Privacy was scarce. And yet, on that March night, privacy became absolute. Each family member isolated, pulled one by one into the barn where the intruder waited. The strange thing is how plausible that sequence seems once you imagine the spaces. A noise in the barn at night wasn't unusual. Animals kick, doors shift, tools fall. If one person went to check and didn't return, another might follow. Concern outweighing caution. The barn was dark, its corners deep with shadow, the perfect stage for surprise. In such close quarters, hesitation lasts only a heartbeat. The walls that usually echoed life became instead a cage for silence. Later investigators tried to map the movement of the intruder through these spaces. They noted the pile of straw used to cover the barn floor, the locked doors, the keys that vanished. They traced footsteps in half-frozen earth outside, leading towards the farmhouse but not away from it. They pointed to the chimney smoke, the bread-baked days after the family was gone, the animals milked and fed. Whoever had moved through Hinterkaifeck in those days did so with eerie familiarity. They knew where things were kept. They knew how to blend into the rhythm of the place. It is here, in the detail of walls and rooms, that the story begins to blur into something more disturbing. Because a stranger, stumbling blind through such a house, might leave chaos behind. But Hinterkaifeck showed no chaos, only quiet. A lived-in quiet. Beds still made, doors locked as they should be, tools hanging neatly where they belonged. The farm seemed not abandoned but tended, as though life had continued, except for the silence in the rooms where voices should have been. Picture it. A visitor passing by in daylight might have glanced at the chimney smoke and thought nothing of it. The shape of the house against the sky was unchanged. Even the animals shifted in their stalls as usual, but step inside, cross the threshold from yard to barn, and you would see at once that the order of things had cracked, that beneath the calm surfaces, the farm had become something altogether different. This duality, the familiar and the horrific, coexisting under one roof, was what left investigators shaking their heads. The farmhouse seemed to cooperate just enough to mask the truth. It allowed the intruder to move within it, to live within it, to vanish without trace. And even now, more than a century later, it's hard not to wonder. Did the walls of Hinterkaifeck simply absorb the strangeness, holding it the way stone holds cold? The farm itself is long gone, demolished in the years after. But in memory, in photographs, in the faded sketches of investigators, it still stands. And once you've walked its halls in your mind, you begin to feel why people never forgot it. It was not just the scene of a crime. It was a stage perfectly designed for mystery. Every beam and brick conspiring to hide more than it revealed. Among the many details that turned Hinterkaifeck from tragedy into legend, none is as unsettling as the footprints. They were found in the days just before the discovery, when snow still lay in patches across the fields. Snow is a cruel witness, fleeting, fragile, but sometimes precise. And here, it left a story written in white. The story began with a single line of prints. Not a tangled mess, not the crisscrossing marks of several people going about farm work, but one deliberate path. The tracks led from the woods towards the farmhouse, step after step, clear enough to count. The stride was steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. Whoever left them was moving with purpose. And then the path stopped. At the edge of the farmhouse, the prints ended. No return trail, no looping arc back to the trees. Just a straight approach, as if someone had walked out of the forest, arrived at Hinterkaifeck, and been swallowed whole. Neighbours later recalled that Andreas Gruber, the head of the household, had mentioned these prints in passing. He had noticed them himself, puzzled that they didn't lead away. He had even spoken of strange noises from the attic, and of a newspaper found in the house that no one in the family subscribed to. It was the kind of unease country folk are quick to dismiss. An old man's nerves, perhaps, or just the ordinary strangeness of life in an isolated place. But when the murders came to light, those footprints became more than odd. They became ominous. The investigators tried to read them like scripture. Were they made by a heavy boot or a lighter step? Did they belong to someone local or a stranger passing through? Snow is too vague to answer such questions with certainty. Melt, wind, and trampling feet soon obscured the prints beyond use. Still, their presence lingered in every retelling of the case. For villagers, the footprints were proof of something uncanny. Who walks into a farm and never walks out? Was the intruder still inside, watching from shadows, moving from room to room with the ease of someone who knew the place? Or had they vanished in some other way, leaving no trace but that eerie line across the snow? For investigators, the prints were a maddening clue, too solid to ignore, too incomplete to be useful. They showed entry without exit, presence without departure. And in a case already riddled with contradictions, they were one more riddle that refused to give a straight answer. It's worth imagining what it must have felt like for the neighbours, trudging through the snow towards Hinterkaifeck after the family had vanished. To know that someone else had walked that same path days before, unseen, unchallenged. To realise that every crunch of their boots mirrored a step already taken by a figure who slipped into the farm and left silence in their wake. In folklore, footprints often carry symbolic weight. The devil's marks, the signs of wandering spirits, the proof of someone who shouldn't be there. Hinterkaifeck absorbed that symbolism effortlessly. For decades after, people would lower their voices when recalling the prints, as though the snow itself had testified against an unseen hand. What remains striking is the calmness implied by those tracks. No stagger, no rush, no doubling back. Whoever approached Hinterkaifeck did so with confidence, perhaps even with familiarity, as if they belonged. As if they knew that once they reached the farm, they would not need to leave quickly. And so the footprints became part of the myth, woven tightly into the fabric of the story. They are cited in every retelling, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes doubted, but always present. They mark not only the approach of a killer, but the moment when the ordinary world of fields and farms tilted into something darker. Long after the snow melted, the impression of those steps remained. A reminder that the land itself had once recorded the arrival of a stranger. Or was it not a stranger at all? And that reminder has never entirely faded. When the dust of the first shock settled, the investigators turned to the next unavoidable question. Who could have wanted this family gone? In small villages, suspicion tends to point inward before it looks outward. And in the case of Hinterkaifeck, the family itself provided fertile ground for theories. The Grubers were not beloved. Andreas, the patriarch, had a reputation that wove together stubbornness, severity, and something far darker. He was known as a hard man, quick to quarrel with neighbours, slow to forgive debts or slights. In the village, his name was spoken more with caution than affection. For years, there had been whispers, allegations of abuse within the household, of control wielded with an iron hand. When tragedy struck, those whispers swelled into open speculation. Victoria, his daughter, complicated the picture further. She was a widow, Young enough still to draw attention, and her relationships with men in the village had already stirred gossip. One name rose above the rest: Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbour who had helped discover the bodies. Once he had been close to Victoria, close enough that people wondered if her young son, Joseph, might actually be his child. If so, then questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and pride all twisted together into something volatile. Even within the household, tensions were noted. Victoria and her father had been accused of an incestuous relationship. Rumours that had even reached the courts years before. Though both had faced legal consequences, the shadow of that accusation never truly lifted. To the villagers, it explained too much and too little all at once. Some saw it as proof of a household corrupted from within, a house that practically invited doom. Others dismissed it as slander, but the seed of suspicion had already taken root. The grandmother, Maria Baumgartner, offered no clear answers. She was new to the farm, a maid employed only the very day before her death. To investigators, her presence was a cruel twist of fate. She had stepped into Hinterkaifeck at precisely the wrong moment, a stranger in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her death added little to motive, but underlined the brutality of what had happened. And then there was young Cecilia, Victoria's daughter, just entering adolescence. Her absence from school had first raised alarms, and her fate cemented the horror of the crime. For investigators, she symbolized innocence destroyed, but also a puzzle. Why had the intruder not spared at least the children? If robbery or revenge had been the motive, why such complete eradication? Within days, the investigators were sketching theories that pointed back into the house itself. Perhaps this had been no intrusion at all, but a quarrel that had spiraled fatally, with a survivor disguising the scene before vanishing. Perhaps someone in the family had snapped. It was a tempting line of thought, one that required no stranger slipping across fields, no mysterious footprints. But it clashed with the facts. Everyone was accounted for among the dead. Unless someone had fled into the woods afterwards, blood on their hands, never to be seen again. The theory collapsed under its own weight. Still, the suspicion lingered. Andreas's reputation was too sharp to ignore. Victoria's relationships too tangled. The rumors too entrenched. Even as investigators widened their net, looking at neighbors and drifters, the shadow of the family's own secrets colored every page of the case file. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of this chapter in the story. The sense that the answers might not lie in a faceless intruder, but in the very people who lived within those thick stone walls. People bound by blood, rumor, resentment, and silence. The village, for its part, found grim satisfaction in such theories. To blame the family was to make the crime self-contained, a storm that destroyed itself from the inside out. It was easier, in a way, than imagining a killer still walking the fields, unseen. But the investigation could not stop at family drama. Beyond those walls lay other suspects. Men and women whose paths had crossed Hinterkaifeck, sometimes briefly, sometimes fatefully, and among them, the most infamous name of all. If the family's tangled secrets offered one path for suspicion, the wider circle of neighbours and outsiders offered another. And in that circle, one name rose again and again: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was no stranger to Hinterkaifeck. He had been close to Victoria Gruber, close enough that many believed her young son Joseph was his child. For a time, he had even spoken of marrying her. But Andreas Gruber, fiercely controlling, was said to have blocked the union. Old resentments grew thicker with each year, especially when financial matters overlapped with personal wounds. In a village where pride was as valuable as land, Such entanglements were explosive. When the bodies were discovered, Schlittenbauer was among the first to enter the barn. That alone was not suspicious. He was part of the search party, after all. But villagers whispered that he had walked straight to the hidden pile of straw, uncovering the bodies as if he had known they were there. Too direct, they said. Too certain. His later behavior did little to silence them. At times he seemed oddly detached, even callous, speaking of the deaths with a strange mix of authority and distance. Whether this was simply his temperament or a sign of deeper knowledge became a favourite subject of tavern debates. But Schlittenbauer was not the only one under scrutiny. Farmhands and maids who had worked at Hinterkaifeck in years prior were questioned. One maid had left suddenly, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She had heard footsteps in the attic, she said, and felt a presence watching her at night. At the time, her words had been dismissed as superstition. After the murders, they sounded chillingly prophetic. Could someone have been secretly living in the house, moving silently between its spaces, waiting for the right moment? There were also whispers of drifters and vagrants. The railway lines that cut through Bavaria brought not just goods and passengers, but also wanderers. Men who moved from farm to farm, offering labour in exchange for food or shelter, then vanishing as quietly as they came. Some investigators considered whether one of these transients had chosen Hinterkaifeck as an easy mark, intending robbery only for things to spiral beyond control. But if robbery was the motive, it was poorly executed. Valuables were left untouched, money unclaimed. And the lingering presence in the house, the animals tended, meals prepared, spoke of something more deliberate than a thief fleeing into the night. Old grudges in the village surfaced too. Andreas Gruber had not made friends easily. He was stubborn, quarrelsome, and unyielding. Land disputes, personal feuds, unpaid debts, all became fodder for theory. Any one of them, villagers said, might have given a man reason enough. But a reason is not the same as an explanation. Anger might spark violence, but could it explain the calculated calm that followed? The feeding of animals, the baking of bread. That detail unsettled even the most pragmatic minds. Police files thickened with names. Some were dismissed quickly, others lingered for years. Each suspect carried a piece of plausibility, but never the whole picture. Too much motive, but no opportunity. Too much opportunity, but no evidence. And so the investigation turned in circles, moving outward, then inward again, like ripples that never reached shore. For the villagers, though, certainty was never the point. Gossip thrives on ambiguity. The identity of the killer became less important than the act of suspecting. Schlittenbauer remained the favourite villain in many retellings. His name muttered in the same breath as Hinterkaifeck for decades to come. Yet in truth, nothing tied him to the crime beyond circumstance and suspicion. And so the list of outsiders, neighbours, farmhands, strangers, never gave investigators the solid ground they needed. Each lead ended in fog. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. The farm itself seemed to mock them, holding its secret tightly. Still, the theories did not stop. They multiplied, weaving themselves into legend. And with every year that passed, Hinterkaifeck became less about one night in 1922, and more about the many possibilities people imagined into its silence. In every great mystery, the human mind cannot resist filling in the gaps. At Hinterkaifeck, the gaps were vast, and the motives proposed over the years piled up like hay in the barn, untidy, contradictory, but each carrying its own sense of plausibility. The simplest theory was robbery. A stranger, or perhaps a passing labourer, decided the isolated farm was easy prey. Yet when investigators searched the house, valuables remained untouched. Cash was found in drawers, jewellery in plain sight. No clear evidence of theft. And the intruder's lingering presence, feeding livestock, stoking fires, did not fit the profile of a thief in flight. Robbery might have been a tempting label, but it explained little. Then came revenge. Andreas Gruber was a man who inspired grudges. His quarrels with neighbours were notorious, his reputation harsh. Some argued that one of those long-festering resentments had finally erupted into violence, perhaps a boundary dispute, a debt, or an insult taken too far. But while plausible, such theories failed to explain the calculated calm afterwards. Rage could kill, yes, but could rage then stay to milk cows and bake bread? Easier to imagine was jealousy. Victoria, young and widowed, drew attention from men in the village. Schlittenbauer's name again surfaced here. If Josef was indeed his son, and if promises of marriage had been thwarted, then jealousy and wounded pride could have merged into fury. To those who disliked Schlittenbauer, the pieces fit neatly. To others, it was too neat. A theory born more of gossip than proof. There were darker suggestions still. The rumours of incest between Andreas and Victoria gave rise to theories of an internal collapse. Perhaps Victoria had tried to escape her father's control. Or perhaps Andreas feared the exposure of secrets already whispered across the village. The theory imagined a household turned upon itself, an implosion rather than an invasion. But again, all were dead. No survivor remained to be cast as the guilty party. And if such a conflict had reached its breaking point, why was the violence staged so deliberately, so carefully concealed beneath straw and silence? As decades passed, new layers of speculation grew. Some spoke of a hired killer, paid to settle debts or disputes on behalf of another. Others imagined a former farmhand, familiar with the layout, returning with grudges sharpened by poverty. Still others leaned towards the uncanny, legends of footsteps in the attic, of the maid's warnings, of a farm watched by someone unseen for days or weeks before the final night. Each motive said more about those proposing it than about the crime itself. The practical-minded favoured robbery. The scandal-hungry leaned on incest and jealousy. The superstitious saw a haunting. The educated suspected calculated revenge. And none of them, even combined, delivered certainty. The most unsettling detail, however, was not in the theories, but in what they all failed to explain. Whoever had done this did not vanish in haste. They stayed, for days, tending animals, maintaining the illusion of normal life. That fact alone stripped robbery, jealousy, and even revenge of their usual shape. It suggested not just intent, but patience. Not just fury, but control. And so the list of motives sprawled into something unmanageable, leaving the investigators with too many answers and no conclusion. Hinterkaifeck resisted categorization. It did not fit neatly into any box. Robbery gone wrong, family feud, jealous lover. Instead, it stood as something singular, an act that bent logic until it snapped. To this day, when people sift through the case, they bring their own biases with them. Some choose the simple explanation, money, others the dramatic, forbidden love. Still others prefer the eerie, a stranger living in the attic, slipping down at night. Each theory feels convincing for a moment, until you hold it up against the stubborn facts and watch it falter. What remains is not a solution, but a mosaic of human imagination, each shard reflecting fear, resentment, or fascination. And that mosaic, more than any single theory, is what has kept Hinterkaifeck alive in memory. Because sometimes the absence of an answer is more powerful than the answer itself. Once the investigators packed up their notes and the rumors began to quiet, the question became, what do you do with a place like Hinterkaifeck? A farm doesn't simply vanish because tragedy has marked it. Fields still need tending, property still exists, and life, awkwardly, stubbornly, goes on. But in this case, going on meant living with a building that had turned into something else entirely. Not a homestead, but a scar. At first, the authorities tried to return the farm to ordinary use. Relatives of the Gruber family attempted to claim inheritance. The land still had value, and in Bavaria, land meant survival. But no one really wanted to live there. Workers brought in to tend the fields spoke of unease. Some said tools shifted places overnight. Others swore they heard footsteps where none should be. Whether these were echoes of imagination or something stranger hardly mattered. The farm had already been given a new identity. Cursed, haunted, forever changed. Visitors came too. Some from neighbouring villages, others from further afield. Morbid curiosity drove them, a desire to see the place where the unthinkable had happened. They wandered the yard, peered into the barn, whispered about the pile of straw where the bodies had been found. The farmhouse became less a home than a grim landmark, a place where the line between fact and folklore blurred with every telling. For the villagers, Hinterkaifeck's presence was both a burden and a business. On the one hand, it cast a long shadow. Children were warned away from its path, and adults avoided speaking its name after dark. On the other hand, stories of the murders kept the village's name alive in the wider region. Strangers asked for directions to the farm, eager to glimpse its silent walls. A place once anonymous became infamous, and infamy lingers longer than harvests. The animals were removed. The barn and the house stood emptier with each passing season. Windows darkened, shutters sagged. Fields grew wild at their edges. By the late 1920s, the debate was no longer about who had committed the crime, but about what to do with the physical shell of it all. In 1923, the decision was made. Hinterkaifeck would be demolished. The house, the barn, the rooms that had held too much silence were torn down. Piece by piece, the walls that had absorbed so many suspicions and secrets were reduced to rubble. The land remained, but the structures were gone, as if the community, unable to solve the mystery, chose instead to erase its stage. But erasure is never complete. A small shrine was placed in the site, a wooden cross to mark what had happened. People still walked there, leaving flowers, pausing for a moment of uneasy silence. Some prayed, others simply stared, as if hoping the ground itself might give up an answer. The cross became a focal point, not just for grief, but for curiosity. Even decades later, locals reported strangers arriving, asking for directions to the murder farm, as if the place still stood. For the families of the victims, life was harder. Children were left orphaned, relatives burdened with grief and with the uncomfortable inheritance of land, tainted by horror. For the village, there was a lingering sense of failure, that such an atrocity had unfolded in their midst, unsolved, unpunished. Every retelling was tinged with that frustration. And so Hinterkaifeck lived on, not in bricks and beams, but in memory. Its absence became as heavy as its presence had been. Where once a farmhouse stood, now only whispers and rumours remained. And perhaps that suited the story better. A demolished building cannot be studied, It cannot be tested for evidence overlooked. It can only be imagined. And imagination, in the end, is what has kept Hinterkaifeck alive long after the last stone was carted away. Time does not heal every wound. In the case of Hinterkaifeck, it seemed only to deepen the scar. The farmhouse was gone by the 1920s, the fields reclaimed, but the story lingered like smoke that refused to clear. And in the decades that followed, Germany changed beyond recognition. Yet the mystery on that patch of Bavarian earth remained stubbornly unsolved. After the Second World War, when the country was reeling from destruction and attempting to piece itself back together, the old case resurfaced. Perhaps it was because in times of chaos, unsolved crimes gain new weight. They become symbols of unfinished business. Or perhaps it was simply that the investigators of the 1920s had left behind so many unanswered questions that new generations of police could not resist reopening the file. In the early 1950s, the case was quietly reviewed again. Surviving villagers were interviewed, names pulled once more from the dust of old reports. Some pointed again to Lawrence Schlittenbauer, though by then he was an old man, carrying the burden of suspicion for 3 decades. His testimony had shifted slightly over the years, not necessarily out of deceit, but because memory bends under repetition. Each time he told the story of entering the barn, it grew a little different. Enough for investigators to raise an eyebrow, though never enough for proof. Other names resurfaced as well. Former farmhands, long scattered, were tracked down and questioned. Some had emigrated, others had vanished into anonymity. A few returned reluctantly to old memories, describing Andreas Gruber's temper, Victoria's struggles, the uneasy atmosphere of the farm. Their words painted the same picture as before. A house, thick with tension, but not necessarily a place marked for slaughter. Forensic science had advanced by then, but not in ways that could save this case. The crime scene had been trampled from the first hour, evidence lost, bodies examined with crude methods. By the 1950s, there was nothing left to test, no samples preserved. All investigators had were statements, rumors, and contradictions. And so they circled again around the same theories, reaching the same dead ends. In the 1960s, the file was dusted off yet again. Some officers believed that progress in criminology might finally allow them to close the case. Others argued it was a waste of time, an old wound better left closed. But Bavaria, proud of its traditions, could not quite let go of a mystery that had made its name infamous. Another round of questioning began, this time with the children of those once suspected. They carried their own resentments. Resentments not just of suspicion, but of being tied unfairly to a crime they had not committed. Through all of this, the central problem remained. There was no new evidence. Investigators leaned heavily on psychology, trying to read motives into long-dead faces, reconstructing personalities from gossip and anecdote. Was Andreas truly capable of driving someone to such an act through cruelty? Was Schlittenbauer's jealousy strong enough to burn for decades? Did a stranger pass through at the worst possible time? Every answer only raised more questions. By the late 1960s, the official stance hardened. The case would remain unsolved. Files were closed, at least formally, though journalists and amateur sleuths continued to pry. Hinterkaifeck had by then crossed over from investigation into legend. The villages had aged, the farmhouse had been erased, but the story refused to fade. What lingered in those post-war inquiries was less about the hope of solving the crime and more about the fear of admitting that some things cannot be solved. For a country trying to rebuild faith in order and justice, Hinterkaifeck was an uncomfortable reminder. Sometimes the truth slips away, and no amount of effort can bring it back. And so the case entered the modern era not as a police file, but as a ghost in the archives, half fact, half folklore, waiting for the next generation to rediscover it. When the facts of a case run dry, folklore rushes in to fill the gaps. Hinterkaifeck, with its muddled investigation and its demolished walls, was fertile ground for legend. What could not be explained by police reports was eagerly reimagined in whispers, stories of hauntings, of cursed land, of voices still carried by the wind across the empty fields. One of the earliest tales came from the maid who had left the farm shortly before the killings. She claimed to have heard footsteps in the attic at night, a presence she could not see but felt constantly watching her. At the time, people dismissed her fears as superstition, the overactive imagination of a young woman unused to the isolation of a remote farm. But after the murders, her words were repeated with shivers. Had someone been living secretly above the family, slipping down at night, waiting? Or was it something less human? Something bound to the farmhouse itself? Children in the surrounding villages dared each other to walk near the site. They told each other that on still nights, you could hear the muffled cries of the victims if you pressed your ear against the earth where the farmhouse once stood. Others swore that the animals in the area grew restless without cause, staring at shadows no one else could see. Farmers claimed their dogs refused to set foot near the ruins, barking wildly at the invisible. The demolished farm itself became a ghost. With the buildings gone, all that remained was open land and the wooden shrine placed there, a cross weathered by decades, standing alone like a marker between worlds. Some swore that when the evening fog rolled in, the outline of the farmhouse could be seen again, just for a moment, as though memory itself had weight. Over time, paranormal enthusiasts adopted the story. Mediums claimed to sense restless spirits lingering on the site. Visitors described sudden chills, the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps in grass that should have been still. The line between curiosity and fear blurred. Hinterkaifeck was no longer just an unsolved crime. It was a place where the rational and the irrational collided. Even the investigators were not immune to superstition. Some noted that the crime seemed almost staged, as though the killer or killers had wanted the scene to echo folklore. The neatly covered bodies in the barn, the strange calm in the days after, the single line of footprints in snow, all read like elements of a grim fairy tale rather than a crime of impulse. Perhaps that was why the case resisted resolution. It had slipped into the realm of story, where truth matters less than effect. By the late 20th century, Hinterkaifeck had become a touchstone in paranormal circles. Books and television programs framed it not only as a true crime, but as a haunting. People asked whether the violence had soaked into the soil, whether the land itself now carried the memory of those final days. Psychics claimed to channel voices of the dead, offering fragmented confessions that never matched, never clarified. Skeptics dismissed it all, yet even they admitted the case had an atmosphere unlike others. Perhaps the legends persist because the case never closed. With no name to blame, no conclusion to draw, people turned to the supernatural as a way to impose meaning. It is easier, in some ways, to believe in restless spirits than in the idea that a human being could commit such an act and then disappear forever. And so Hinterkaifeck lives on in two parallel worlds, one of cold, unsolved crime, and one of whispered stories about shadows and silence. Between them lies the truth, untouchable, obscured, perhaps lost. But in the fog of those Bavarian fields, who can say the difference between memory and ghost? By the time the last investigator closed the file, Hinterkaifeck had already left the realm of solvable mystery. It became something else. A riddle that refuses to fade. A story retold not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. And in that absence of closure lies its power. The unanswered questions are as stark today as they were in 1922. Who walked across the snow, leaving footprints that entered but did not leave? Who stayed in the farmhouse after the family was gone, quietly feeding animals and stoking the hearth? Was the motive greed, jealousy, revenge, or something stranger, a combination we can no longer imagine? Each hypothesis seems convincing for a moment, until it collapses under its own contradictions. Theories have multiplied across the decades, growing wilder as the facts grow colder. Some insist on the neighbour, pointing to old grudges and too much familiarity with the scene. Others argue for a stranger, a drifter who vanished back into anonymity. A few see the case as an internal implosion, a family secret consuming itself. And then there are those who prefer the uncanny explanations. An unseen watcher in the attic, a haunting that turned violent, a curse carried by the land. None can be proved. All carry their own weight. Perhaps that is why the fascination endures. Hinterkaifeck is not just about 6 deaths on a Bavarian farm. It is about the limits of certainty, about how even in a world obsessed with reason, with evidence, with closure, there are places where truth slips beyond our grasp. We look back across a century and find ourselves staring not at answers, but at the same silence that hung over the fields in 1922. The demolition of the farmhouse did not erase that silence. If anything, it sharpened it. With no building to study, no rooms to reconstruct, all that remains is imagination. Photographs, diagrams, witness statements. Each fragment invites interpretation, and each interpretation leads to another dead end. The physical absence of Hinterkaifeck only strengthens its presence in story. For the village, the legacy was complicated. They carried not just grief, but stigma. To be from the area meant to live under the shadow of a crime that became a symbol. Children grew up hearing the name whispered like a warning. Outsiders came searching for the murder farm, reducing local history to a single night of violence. Even today, the word Hinterkaifeck evokes more than a place. It evokes unease. For the wider world, the case has become a touchstone for unsolved mysteries. It appears in books, documentaries, podcasts. Each retelling sharpens certain details, softens others, weaving fact and folklore until they are inseparable. Hinterkaifeck has become less about finding the killer and more about confronting the unknowable. And that may be the real legacy. The reminder that not every riddle yields to investigation. That sometimes the silence is the answer. A farmhouse stood once in the Bavarian woods, and in March 1922, something happened there that no one could untangle. Nearly a century later, we are still staring into that silence, asking questions the land refuses to answer. Hinterkaifeck remains, gone, demolished, yet alive in memory. A place where mystery thickened into permanence, a story that resists ending. And perhaps that is why, even now, people lean closer when they hear its name. Not because they expect the solution, but because they recognize the deeper truth. Some shadows never lift. And that sleepless rabble is where we leave Hinterkaifeck. An empty farm in the Bavarian woods. A mystery that has outlived everyone who once whispered about it. and a silence that still seems heavier than stone. There are no neat answers, no sudden revelations waiting in the archives. Just shadows, rumours, and the knowledge that sometimes history prefers to keep its secrets. Maybe that's why this story lingers, because it never resolves, and because in that gap, our minds can't help but wander. If you've made it this far, thanks for keeping me company in the quiet. If you'd like more nights like this, you know what to do, like subscribe and stick around. And if you feel like sharing, tell me, did you know this story before tonight? Or was this your first time wandering into Hinterkaifeck? For now, close your eyes, let the fog settle, drift, while the mystery stays behind to watch over the fields. This was Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to one of history's strangest riddles. Sleep well, sleepless rabble.